So I'm going to try and do Mission Impossible here and get a ceasefire between the new atheist community and the progressive community.
What Kyle is trying to do is bring together these two parties. And I've been critical of Sam Harris, but only based upon what I've read of his and what I've heard him espouse. I don't know if he considers himself a new atheist or not. I don't really care.
Try to abide by what I call the 50% rule. Now, this is a goofy rule I made up for myself, and I try to stick to it as well. And the idea behind it is, if you agree with somebody on 50% of things or more, that person is not worthy of the same level of scorn that you would give to a character like Rush Limbaugh or Bill O'Reilly or Sean Hannity or Michelle Bachmann or Sarah Palin, or people that are just fucking buffoons. So if you look at secular talk clips, when I go after the ultra-conservatives, of course I go after them and I mock them and I hammer them and I go to town because I think it's merited.
There was one part that I just wanted to address. There's a lot of the stuff, frankly, I just don't. He says that if you agree with somebody 50%, then you shouldn't attack them for a specific view. I don't get that. I don't know what that means.
And why 50% as opposed to any other?
Just one thing, I personally believe that the white race is superior and that laws ought to reflect that, and you don't believe that. Then you could say, well, look, don't be so angry with this person. I mean, you guys agree on most issues. And I would say, no, you know what? Actually, a certain kind of disagreement can be so significant that you do end up regarding that person as an adversary, not an ally, notwithstanding the fact that you agree on lots of other different issues, especially when the disagreement is, found in the area where that person is exerting the greatest influence, or a certain idea can become sort of so pernicious that it outweighs agreement on other issues. Right. And I think that... So
here's a segment and where he talks about stop calling the new atheists neocons, I think it is. Let's listen to this segment.
They are X, they're not. Okay, next. And this one, it feeds into the last one as well. Stop calling them neocons. They're not neocons. You know what a neocon is? Dick Cheney. You know what a neocon is? George Bush. You know what a neocon is? Donald fucking Rumsfeld. If you actually believe that Sam Harris or Bill Maher or Richard Dawkins are as dumb and wrong as Dick Cheney or George Bush, that's ridiculous. You simply have not read their books if you think that's the case, or you have not listened to them talk. Bill Maher has been the toughest ever on George Bush and Dick Cheney. He could not be more tough on them. Okay, and again, go through the policy positions that, okay, they're all in favor of abortion. They're all in favor of being economically liberal. They're all in favor of gay rights. You simply can't say that that's like George Bush and Dick Cheney. It's not. It's not. So stop calling them neocons. It's not true. It's not accurate.
Neocon, as used in the context of the Bush era, was to describe, and I would not say that George Bush was a neocon. I mean, in a very technical sense. Dick Cheney, yes. Donald Rumsfeld, yes, arguably. Richard Pearl, yes. Paul Wolfowitz, yes. Joe Lieberman, yes. Because they believed that in a new American century, one could export democracy and Western values via violence, and that one was compelled to do so.
Which in certain cases are not only ethical, but you would have to be a monster not to do them, right? And I think you can easily think of a situation where you, by refusing to get your hands dirty and make the person in your custody at all uncomfortable, you would be a monster, right? And actually the case in the Stanford Encyclopedia is a perfect case.
So thus you had this split between paleocons and neocons. Now, I got news for you. Paleocons don't necessarily agree with abortion or gay marriage. In fact, I know they don't. Dick Cheney, for gay marriage. That's not the dividing line when we talk about neocons.
Point number 2 is, I would really like it if progressives criticized the doctrine of Islam as much as they criticize the doctrine of Christianity. Now, I understand, and many people understand, why it is you don't do that, because there aren't as many Muslims in America, and you feel more responsible for the Christian fundamentalists and the neoconservatives than you do for Muslim extremism. But either way, for objectivity's sake, if we can all agree, and most of us do, that the religions are false, they're incorrect, and you're not part of the groups, well then, take the doctrines, like we always cite Bible verses in Christianity that are fucking idiotic. But we don't do it nearly as much for Islam, and we should. We can talk about, what is it, the flying horse and the yellow cow in Islam, and the fact that slavery's in Islam, and all the passages kill the infidel. We should get into just as much specifics against the doctrine of Islam as we do against Christianity.
It's because he is expressing a view that there is something inherently problematic in this religion, this non-Western religion, that is problematic not just with those who commit acts of violence, but those who take a poll saying that, well, I subscribe to the same principles that these people do, short of ever acting upon it in a violent way.
And there was this quote from Sam Harris that to me kind of illustrates the crux of the disagreement. He said, look, liberals think Dick Cheney is a really bad person who did a lot of really bad things. And that's fine. You can think that. But what liberals need to understand in order for them to be rational is that there are tens of millions of Muslims in the world who are, quote, far scarier than Dick Cheney.
You say, well, the problem with new atheists is that they generalize about Muslims. Yeah, but then you're generalizing about new atheists if you lump them all in and you say, wow, come on, they're really conservative.
And I'm genuinely happy to talk to you, but our listeners need to know that this conversation is a direct result of the conversation you had with Greenwald. And Glenn came on your show and just ran me down for the better part of an hour. Okay, he misrepresented my views, as he always does. He compared me to neo-Nazis he's known in his capacity as a lawyer. He called me a coward. I told the world that I change my views whenever people find them offensive, and then I falsely claimed to have been misrepresented. And you more or less agreed with him on that point, and we'll definitely get into that.
I mean, I represented neo-Nazis for almost a decade as a First Amendment lawyer and represented their free speech rights, which were under a pretty systemic attack in a way that would have set really bad precedent. So I know a lot of their tactics. And before I ever encountered new atheists and these people who are kind of obsessed with the Quran and Islam, despite not having studied it, I watched how neo-Nazis talked about Jews, which was, their kind of bête noire. And the thing, they looked at Jews exactly like some, kind of like anti-Muslim obsessives look at Islam. And
Greenwald is 90% of what he says is undermining of the possible rational conversation and the necessary rational conversation we have to have on this topic. And he's doing it in the most cynical and most destructive way. And again, the price that people pay for this, the price that I have paid for this reputationally, the price that people I know, the price that Ayan has paid for this is intolerable, right? And it is keeping, it's like who asked you ask who would run for president now, given what you have to go through to run for president? Well, who will talk sensibly about these issues, given what you have to go through, right? It's unbelievable. And I know you pay attention to these things, but you see 5% of what I see directed at me, right? It is fucking incredible. And yet in the context of this discussion, I get pilloried as a lunatic, right? And then he invited me on to clean up the mess. And that is what's happening now. Okay, Glenn is a totally unscrupulous defamer of people. Greenwald doesn't have a journalistic bone in his body. I have never seen someone so maliciously unconcerned about misrepresenting the views of his opponents. I mean, apart from the other people we're talking about here, like Reza Aslan and Glenn's deranged colleague, Murtaza Hussain. I mean, these people are glorified cyberbullies. They're not journalists. They're not scholars. And they're certainly not intellectuals. Now, they almost never admit mistakes, okay, much less correct them. And practically everything they put out there is a half-truth.
You think about just that kind of line of thinking of the Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris, where, Islam is the ultimate evil, and, our morality and our intent is really ultimately what matters most.
Well, that's kind of what led me to ultimately be significantly more in the Noam Chomsky camp than, that camp, is that their analysis is not really sophisticated. And, I actually spoke on my channel to Sam Harris, and I remember really trying to get to the brass tacks of what his beliefs are when it comes to foreign policy. And I just remember basically his only point that he kept reiterating in different ways is that, well, listen, if Dick Cheney had his druthers, he would want to make Iraq like Nebraska. Like, that's what he kind of kept saying over and over. And I thought, like,
Wow.
what a silly, like, that's just such a ridiculous way of viewing the world. It's almost like you can just brush aside all of the crimes committed by U.S. empire and just kind of say, well, listen, I guess he...
I noticed was Abby Martin. I don't know if people know who she is, but
Yes.
she's another person who attacks me as a racist and Islamophobe and a psychopath.